Um, Hello, everybody. This is Ethan. Anywho, my content is spread across two different channels in no particular order because I'm disorganized, or well, not so well, and also I'm still learning the tech. Hopefully, that will be fixed, and these videos will be edited as well at some point. So first, I'm going to start with some corrections. Sometimes, I'm flying without a net. I don't have a script, so I just start talking. Sometimes I have notes. So sometimes I just say something wrong, not even though I know the right thing. It just comes out incorrect. For example, I said that my mother lived in Gales Point with her girlfriend, and then I said boyfriend. It was a boyfriend. Yeah, I don't think she ever had a real girlfriend. Okay, and then I I said that when I was in Phoenix, Arizona, I took 6 Libriums and then drank whiskey, which could have killed me. Libriums are similar to Valium. I don't know that I don't know if they make them anymore, but yeah, if you take that with alcohol, it becomes even more dangerous. But fortunately, I don't think I drank any whiskey. I fell asleep off the Librium before the whiskey arrived, so that may have saved my life. Who knows? Um, when I was and then I said, in Punta Gorda, I used the names Valerie and then the name Vanessa to describe the same woman. Vanessa is the acronym that I'm going to use for her. Okay. So before I get back to my Punta Gorda story, I'm going to switch back for a bit. I mentioned that when I was in 1977, I was in San Francisco in June, and I attended the what was then called the Gay Pride March, because it was considered a protest, not a parade at that time. And it could get pretty wild because there was no vetting process for who marched in it or who tabled, etc. But I wasn't really following that at the time. But then I felt a urge to go in the parade myself because that's kind of how I was, and so I just went in, and I wound up with a bunch of marching with a bunch of lesbians. But being as how I was 14, they were nice and indulgent, and didn't give me a hard time. And then I went to Civic Center, and I stepped out of the parade, which gave me kind of a. Then I could see how big the crowd actually was, and I was surprised by how many of them there were, and then so by extension, how many gay people there are. We didn't use the GBLT acronym back then. Yeah, and some guy said, "Hey, don't be afraid of me." He was right. He was kind of feminine. I was a little afraid. I mean, the whole thing was kind of, a little much, but I got through it, and but I'm not gay, so I just went as an ally. Okay, when I was in Bailey's City with Ruby, at one point I was by myself standing in her balcony, and I saw a bunch of guys hanging out by the outhouse. And I said, "Hey," and one of them said, "Hey, honky." That is the only time during that year that I've heard that particular racial slur. Especially when I got out of the city and into more rural areas, people were much more chill about that kind of thing. And in Punta Gorda, they did call me Whitey for like the whole time I was there. But it was different because in this case, that was not an insult. In the United States, it would have been. And maybe, one would fear of violence if one were called by that name. But that was not the case down there. It was just a descriptor. And like there was this one house. It had a toddler that would hang out in front, a little boy. And every time I went by, he would say, "Back me, Whitey, back me," which he meant give him a piggyback ride. So I would. Yeah. So let me just basically set the picture of who I was living with when I was in Punta Gorda. So this general atmosphere, I mean, literally the atmosphere where it's warm, a bit muggy, and has the smell of rotting vegetation around it, and also the sea breeze and the smell of the sea. I like that kind of thing. I'd experienced it in Hawaii already, but this was a more chill. For me, it was more fun than Hawaii had been. Not that I didn't have fun there, but I just remember these memories were coming up. Like one time I went to school with, what they call high waters. And somebody said, "Geez, if you go to school like that, people are going to say, going crabbing." I'm like, well, whatever. And those words aren't particularly hurtful in and of themselves. Like, is there anything wrong with a person who goes out in short pants in order to catch crabs in the low tide or whatever? I don't think so. But what was really drove me to madness was the sheer repetition of it, because every kid who saw me just had to yell, "Going crabbing." Side note, I don't know how it started that slightly too short, or ankle pants that go up your ankle became a fashion felony for men. In California too, they're always like, "Oh God, you've got floods on, you've got high water, blah blah." Women can do it and get away with it. It's frustrating, but now I think it's coming back into style, which is good because most pants are too long for me, and sometimes if I get them trimmed, then they'll be a little too short, and it's hard to get it right for me. Okay, so and then also in Hawaii, I remember they were like, for example, well, they would ring bells, and I would walk as we change. When a class ended, they would ring the bell, which was loud, and I would go to a different class, and all these other kids would be going to different classes and talking loudly while this bell was clanking, and I was kind of overstimulating for me. And one time on the school bus, they started singing. They played this song, "Shimmy Shimmy Cocoa Puff," which is like, is that even English? What does it mean? But all the kids joined in, and they were playing that kind of pop music at the swimming pool. They like their pop music in Hawaii. I didn't and don't like a lot of American pop music. Now in Belize, yeah, they played a little bit of that kind of stuff, American pop, but then they played that stuff from the Caribbean, and that stuff was just awesome as far as I was concerned. So now I'm back to Punta Gorda, and I'll just set the scene here. As I mentioned, there were 4 females living in the house with me. Vanessa, who I guess owned the house and was certainly the alpha of the household. She was 21. She was Garifuna, which means that she was dark. Basically just looked like a dark black woman, unless you look closely at the high cheekbones, and then you saw evidence of her indigenous blood, because Garifuna are black and indigenous mix. And then age 20, Maggie. So these, the 3 other women were half sisters. They were the O'Shaughnessy half sisters, and there are a couple more of them that I know of in different places. But apparently, their ancestor had been Irish, as evidenced by the Irish last name and sometimes first names. And apparently, he had the distinction of being the first person hung in British Honduras for the crime of killing a child or more than one child, something like that. The people, aside from the indigenous people, the people who settled Belize first, a lot of them were Baymen, meaning pirates. And it sounds like, and then when that dried up, they became, started becoming lumberjacks and whatever, but they were still pirates inside. And that sounds consistent with what they told me. And they still had a little bit of that, pirate DNA in them, I speculate. Anyway, so the oldest of the 3 was Maggie, and she was short and thin and basically just looked like a light-skinned black woman. These sisters, there were so many half-sisters in a very multicultural, multiracial environment that they didn't necessarily even look like they were the same race. So then the 14-year-old, which was, oh my goodness, sorry, I will edit this thing. So, okay. Margarita, she was 14. She had brown, not black, but brown skin, brown eyes, long dark, black hair. She looked like she could have been Asian Indian or perhaps Asian Indian Spanish breed, intermixing. But she had a reddish tint to her hair, which could have been a manifestation of the Irish DNA. I don't know. It seems likely. And then and she was the prettiest one in the house. Let's get real. She was the one that was attracting all sorts of guys. The most, they were all attracting guys, but she had a couple of police officers that were into her. So the youngest, 13, and I will call her Margarita, and she was a shade lighter, I guess, than Margarita. Rosa. A bit basically the same kind of thing. Light skin, black, straight black hair, black brown eyes, and such. And slightly different features, but not too different looking. There was also, Vanessa had a Garifuna sister who would come, and who well, she didn't come around much. Vanessa had Vanessa had 3 kids, and sometimes they stayed at our place and sometimes they stayed at her sister's place, so they kind of went back and forth. And her sister also had a little Mayan girl that she had adopted. Apparently, it's not so uncommon for Garifuna to adopt Mayan kids, and yet for some reason, a lot of Mayans were bigoted against Garifuna. Okay, and then Marguerite had 3 kids of her own. One was about 4, basically Garifuna looking, dark and so forth. And then the second one was 5 and was a bit lighter, and more also African blood looking, but lighter. And then she had a boy that was a toddler, and what did he look like? He basically looked like a brown skinned black kid. And then there was her niece. Margarita had a niece who was also in her early adolescence, and she looked like a slim and, of course, smaller Garifuna girl, which she was. Okay, so that was a cast of characters, and these kids kind of came and went. They weren't there all the time. Sometimes they were. Yeah. And it was interesting. A lot of Garifuna had both a Garifuna name and also an English name. Some of them, however, only went by a Garifuna name, and some of them only went by an English name, and I'm not sure why, but the 4-year-old was called Sasna. She was dark, and she was the most popular. She was prettiest and smartest. At one point, when her mother, Vanessa, was smoking weed, it gave her a hit, which we all thought was funny. I don't think so anymore. The smart kid, and too young, man, too young. But there were a lot of hippies doing the same thing with weed and sometimes even psychedelics. So not unique. And then the 5-year-old was named Gail. So you see what I mean about these. She had an English name. And I don't remember what the boy was named. And the Mayan girl was named Hinky, which I don't know if that's a Garifuna name or a Mayan name. Who knows? A lot of people seem to think that the Mayans are extinct. That is very far from true. They're city-states, they had city-states, fairly sophisticated, but they fell for some reason, even before European contact. But the people themselves, they just went back to like subsistent farming. And there's plenty of them stretching from southern Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, El Salvador. Lots of Mayans, lots of sub-ethnic groups. I think there's 30 different Mayan, I guess, sub-tribes that speak 30 different Mayan dialects. In Belize, there were basically two. The largest one was the Mopan Mayans. And I know that when they said hello, it meant they would say Dios, meaning hello, which seems to be derived from the Spanish Buenos Dias. And then the Quechua are a smaller group. And I managed to visit both of them in Belize, Mopan and Quechua village. So yeah. I guess I'll talk a little bit of the some of the side trips. There will probably be sex in later on in this video. I mean, not sex, but me talking about some things that happened along those lines. Okay, side trips. When I was in school in St. Peter Claver College, which was high school, I had a friend, made friends with a guy who was a Quechua Mayan, spoke English and Creole, perfectly well. A number of people in those villages, especially the older ones, didn't. But I got to spend the weekend in his home, and now I know that they do ecotourism tours where you can stay in a Mayan village with a group of other gringos, and there's rules and so forth. No, this time it was just me and some Quechua Mayans, and I guess their houses were thatch roofs for sure. The frames were made out of thin bamboo that lived there. The floor was packed dirt, which, as I said, was pretty sanitary, not loose dirt. And I think the walls may have been thatched as well. So that was interesting. Later, I went to a Mopan village in the Mopan Maya village of San Pedro, Colombia. I went by myself. I wound up staying with a couple of men who were Peace Corps volunteers, and they really didn't seem to be doing that much. But they like to drink, and they got a bottle of, they took me in for a short time, made me food, and shared their anisette, which is this licorice tasting, I guess, hard liquor, which, will give you a buzz pretty fairly quickly. When I was in school, while I was still in school, we went on a field trip, an overnight field trip to the Garifuna village, known as, in English, as Stan Creek, and in Garifuna as Gangriga. So we visited the high school there. Now, as I said, most of the high schools in Belize were basically church schools, in collaboration with the government, because the government couldn't afford to do it alone. And it was rare, but quite common for people to go to elementary school and junior high at a Wesleyan school, a Protestant school, and then go to high school in a Catholic school. I guess at least it gave them some perspective. But this place in Stan Creek, aka Dengriga, I think it might have been an exception. I think, as I recall, it was completely government run, and the Garifuna boy, Andy Palacio, boy at the time, he had this budding conscious. He later become a very famous down in Central America musician and cultural influencer, and he already had this like vague idea about communism or some sort of socialism that was further to the left than the centrist socialism that Belize had all the time. And so when we went to this school, and I think maybe it was a little nicer than the one in Punta Gorda, and he said, you see, when the government runs a school, it's nicer. Well, I don't know if Andy Palacio ever got to take a look at American public schools, but if he had, or especially if he looked at the state of them now, I think he might have realized that it's a bit more complicated than that, and government-run schools are not always great, although it does allow us to have some semblance of separation of church and state, which of course religious schools do not. And then I mentioned that in the Garifuna village, anyway, in Stan Creek, some guy who ran a hotel offered to let me stay in it for free, which I did, and the rest of the kids went and slept overnight in the school. And I heard that they didn't have much sleep, but they, had a lot of fun. So who knows, maybe I missed out. Barranco, the Garifuna village that you could not get to without a private boat. You had to either have one or hire one, or have a friend take you there as a favor and back. And so, as I mentioned, there were 4 outsiders living there at the time. I said that one of the men was English and one of them was American. That's incorrect. So one of them was an American with an American Jewish wife, and the other one was American with a Salvadorian wife. The 3 of them, they'd all met while the 3 of them were in the Peace Corps in El Salvador, which sounds like a pretty rough place from how they described it and how others have described it. I've only been to the airport and seen it from the air, but that wasn't until the 90s. All right. I'll talk more about that later. So, I might as well talk about my first trip to Livingston, Guatemala. So that was when I was still in school, and I went with Vanessa and with Margarita, the 14-year-old, and we stayed with Vanessa's Garifuna relatives. And they had, that kind of construction, again, mud floors, thin bamboo, like frame, and dried coconut leaf thatch on both the roof and the walls. So, kind of basic. But I stayed there and I had fun. I heard Vanessa talk to them in a mix of Garifuna and English. She'd say, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, blah, 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 blah. I was walking. Vanessa had a Garifuna name and an English name. I was walking with Margarita, and we passed a hotel with some Americans sitting in the balcony. And I'd been there, for months there was only one American living in Punta Gorda, and he was a horrible person. Get to that later. Anyways, I saw these guys, and so I wanted to talk to them. It's perfectly understandable. So I went up onto the balcony and sat amongst them and talked. And then I saw Margarita under the balcony. So I shouted down, "Tell Jaime to be back Lee while." In other words, tell Vanessa that I'll be back in a little while. And she said, "Wifey like hippies, den." Obviously, the den stretched out means a lot. And the backpackers that I was sitting with all cracked up. And then they said, "What was that language you were speaking?" I said, "Oh, that's Belizean Creole. It's basically just English." And he said, "Well, I couldn't understand what you said." I said, "Really? You couldn't understand that?" He said, "No. I had by now, my brain had switched gears a lot. I could understand it. I could speak it to a certain degree. Yeah. And then we took a day trip on a ferry boat to the Guatemalan city of Puerto Barrios, which by the standards of cities is not a very good one. But Margarita had only seen Belize City and Puerto Barrios, which frankly, neither of them in the scale of world cities, neither of them are really nice cities. But she liked them just because they were cities. And, she'd been grown up in a small town. I felt pretty cool by this time because I felt like I had gotten so assimilated into Belizean culture that now I was visiting another country with them, and we were like on the same level there, especially in Punta Gorda, which isn't Garifuna. Like we were all travelers in a foreign country together, which I thought was super neat. There was a market with colorful polyester shirts and plastic belt buckles with pictures and stuff. That all seemed pretty, it seems corny here, did even at the time, really. But there it was like some pretty sophisticated fashion technology. And then we went to a soccer game between Belize and the Punta Gorda team and the Puerto Barrios team. And I'm not much of a sports watcher, but I do kind of like soccer. First of all, it's simple and you can follow it. But the more interesting part of it to me is that it's played often between different countries. So a lot of political rivalry manifests in these games and the audience's reaction to them. And of course, Belize and Guatemala were in a super tense territorial dispute. Anyway, that was fun for me. Yeah, the sport itself was okay, the game, but the whole framework in which it was occurring was interesting. Um, Punta Gorda mostly just received 2 radio stations. One was Radio Belize, which was pretty cool. It had news reports, BBC News, local news, music, commercials. Anyway, it was a pretty nice, I liked it, a pretty cool station. And then there was Radio Amatique, which was from Guatemala. And Radio Amatique, there were 2 things that they said over and over again. One was 2 little jingles. Lucas Serra Presidente, because there was a presidential candidate coming up. The candidates were 3 generals and 1 lieutenant. And you could really tell which general was going to win because he got about 3 times as much advertising as all the rest of them put together. I would learn more about this when I got deeper into Guatemala. But not good. This military dictatorship. What else can you call it? There were a lot of police, and the civil war that Guatemala was in, never a 35-year civil war that I was not aware of while I was there. But I was aware something strange was up. It never really entered Livingston, which was removed, but there were soldiers and police walking around with huge guns. Now, in contrast, the Belizean police did not carry guns at all. They just had short little clubs. And yeah, I did see them draw blood with them once. But still, that's a lot different from them shooting somebody, as has started to become quite common here. I think the UK was doing that at the time as well. Their bobbies, their coppers, their police just had these little wooden clubs, and not guns. But I think that's changed because the world has changed, and not entirely for the better. We went from Punta Gorda to Livingston on a sailboat, and the pilot was this guy. I'll just call him Mark. And he was basically a predator, more so than I realized at first. I remember Margarita was, he was hitting on her, and I think I tried to get between them in some way, which was, kind of stupid. And he showed me that it was kind of stupid. Basically, he stuck his fingernail into my hand until it drew blood. And I was like, okay, I get the hint. What would I have done, if he had really gotten violent? I was on the bay with him. I don't know that I could have swam to shore by myself. Probably not for a lot of it. So, yeah. And when we got there, there was this hill going up. Right up the hill, there was this concrete road, and at top, there was a statue. And when I saw that, for some reason, I was just like, oh, this is so cool. It's so exotic the first time I saw it. A lot of the buildings were, I guess, concrete, painted in pastel colors as they do in Latin America to, otherwise it would be just ugly concrete buildings. And instead it was pastel colored concrete buildings, which does look better. So on the way back, sailing with the same guy and the same two people, the two same women and the same pilot. And I know there was maybe one or two other people, and there was a little toddler, a girl who was just learning to talk, and there was an infant as well. And so we started coming back with a motor. I think that's how we got there. The sailboat did not have a sail up, it had a motor. So that's what we started doing coming back. But they ran out of gas. So then they put up the sail. And shortly after that, the wind came, and instead of blowing it along, it just ripped the sail in two. Fortunately, they knew the tides. They knew that we could just drift back to Punta Gorda. It would just take longer, but we had enough food and so on. And it did take us, we wound up spending the night with, in the boat, which was fine. I didn't realize just how predatory Mark actually was. I would find out later. It's probably good I didn't know. And he had a girl to focus on at the time. At one point, I remember the little toddler looked at the infant and said, she wasn't very verbal, but she said, "Baby, baby, baby," which I thought was kind of endearing. Cute. And then we got home finally, and that was that trip. So now I'm back in the house in Punta Gorda, and there's this crowded bed situation again, where sometimes people were just lying in bed with me because it was the only bed in the house, and sometimes not, and it was not always clear to me which one was happening at the time. Vanessa had she let me fool around with her a little bit. On this particular night, her and me and Margarita was lying in the bed. Vanessa was in the middle. And it was dark. And I suddenly realized that Margarita and Vanessa were fooling around with each other. And I was kind of annoyed that I couldn't watch it. At one point, I heard Margarita say, "We bad too, We like them gals in the magazines." So apparently they'd gotten a hold of a porno mag with lesbian sex, probably from the British soldiers. And they were experimenting. And then I heard Margarita say, "It no tastes nice." And I knew just what she was talking about because Vanessa had some kind of fluid that came out of her breasts when you sucked them, but it didn't taste good. It took me a while to realize what the bad taste in my mouth had been when I had done it. So, and I said, "Can I turn the lights on?" And Margarita said, "For what?" And like, okay, I'm like I was harsh in their mellow, so I just lay there and let them do whatever in the dark. I don't know if it was the same night or a different night, but it was the same bed and the same three cast of characters, and the lights were on. Just to explain, there was this thing they did in Bailey's, which I picked up, unfortunately, and it's really not very cool. Which was like, if somebody found out you had had sex with a particular woman, they'd say, "Did she shake? Did she shake?" Meaning, did she move her hips while you were doing it? And of course, the girls in their early teens couldn't be expected to know how to do that, but nevertheless, they were. So I was lying on my stomach, and Vanessa kind of, she got on my back. Okay, trigger warning. It's gonna, more sex stuff coming up. She rubbed her labia between my cheeks. So it was kind of a simulation of her doing anal sex on me, to the extent that a female with no toy can to a man or a male. And I thought, I liked it. I liked this whole role switch thing. I thought it was kind of fun. And then she said, "Shake." And suddenly I got the point, which is that when somebody is on top of you, including on top of your hips, moving your hips around is really not all that easy. So she taught me something there. And then, well, we did this like, how do I put it? This thigh friction thing, which I was able to attain satisfaction with. I wasn't sure if we'd had intercourse or not. And at one point, she talked to me and maybe Margarita again, and she said, "You never fork me, not true?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "He no even know what he the fork." Yeah. Later I was able to actually go all the way, but the first time it didn't go well because her pants weren't completely off, and there was this zipper cutting me, and I said something like, "Something to cut me," and that kind of killed the mood. Okay, so another side trip coming up. As I said, I'd gone down there to look in on this piece of land, Moho Bowl, which my father had bought. It had been a working plantation in the 1960s, and I was supposed to look in on it, but you could only get there via private boat. And so the guy who took me there, and he also lived there, and he lived out there on the river, and let me stay with him for a bit, and then let me see the land. So we went out in his little, I guess, motorboat along the side, along the coast, the jungle of the coast. And then we turned down the Mayan River, and my father had wrote a rough draft for a book about this place called Dragons in the Trees. And I saw what he meant. The trees were full of iguanas, big iguanas, multicolored, green, red, gray. The red one was particularly cool, and I was seeing all of them. And then guess what we had? He served me for dinner that night. Iguana, and it really did taste like chicken. There was an 80s comedian who did this routine. He said, tastes just like, try weasel, try squirrel, tastes just like chicken, tastes just like chicken. Well, if it tastes just like chicken, why not just eat some chicken? And their reason for that down there was that there were a lot more iguanas than there were chickens. So that was logical. So yeah, I ate iguana for dinner. We had some rum and 7-Up. He said that I could spend the night with a local Mayan girl. All I had to do was buy her a drink or something. To me, paying any amount of money for that activity just seemed like, why should I have to do that? Well, but those Mayans were awfully beautiful. But I didn't do it. And I got drunk on, I was drinking this rum and 7-Up and got drunk. I guess he got kind of drunk too. He told me, well, he was a communist, a Marxist, but he had been a mercenary. He was English. He had been a mercenary with the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. And the story he told me was if he either killed somebody or found somebody dead, he said the Vietnamese usually, instead of going to the bank, they turn their extra money into gold and they put most of it. Women had some thin gold necklaces sometimes, I guess, but most of it went into their teeth. So they had gold teeth, and it wasn't necessarily because to fill cavities or whatever. Their mouths were their banks, and he knew that. So he carried a little leather bag around his neck and a pair of pliers. And whenever he encountered a dead body, he would look in the mouth at the teeth to see if there was gold in them, and if there were, he would just yank them out and put them in his bag. And then later, of course, when he had more time and equipment, he would separate the gold from the teeth and throw away the teeth. And he said that's how he got the money to go to Belize and to build a house there, was from these Vietnamese gold fillings. Yeah, I was stuck out there with this maniac too. Anyway, when we got kind of drunk, and I had told him that I wanted to keep traveling south, Guatemala and further. And he said, well, you've got to learn to defend yourself. You know how to fight. And I kind of thought of myself as a pacifist and a Gandhian or whatever, spiritual in whatever way. So I didn't fight, and I didn't think I needed to fight and I didn't really need to fight. I was living off of naivete, and that worked down there. Sometimes just barely, but it did work. But he said, I got to teach you some martial arts. You can learn some defense, some martial arts, then you can go all the way down, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Colombia, Uruguay, Paraguay. Describing all the countries, naming the countries in Central and South America that were to the south of us. So he said, come on. And we both were tipsy. And he said, okay, come at me. So I came at him and he punched me. Probably not intentionally. I mean, he didn't have his mind set in his mind that he would, make up this excuse to just punch me. But nevertheless, he did punch me. He told somebody later, well, he was fairly large and he was coming right at me. He told me to. So I actually started crying at that point. I was 15. So I went back to his bed, the guest bed, under some mosquito netting. Oh, there were a lot of mosquitoes down there. As soon as you got onto land, they just were. And my father, he wrote about that in his journal, how he dreamed of living there and, taking a wife and having children and having grandchildren and marrying his cousins to each other. But while he was having all this fantasy, the mosquitoes kept biting him, and so he didn't stay there. And yet for some reason he thought that maybe I would stay there, and I thought so too, but come on, this isolated place with jillions of mosquitoes. And he had a local wife there as well, a local Black Creole wife. And the next day, we decided to go a bit further down the river and look at the land, Moho Bull, which was the purpose of my taking this side trip. And so we did. My father had been paying the taxes for the place, which was not much. And he had been sending somebody to keep the bush down so that it would continue to be a healthy plantation. He was sending the guy money. I don't know if it was a guy or a woman, but he was sending somebody money regularly to do this. And when I first got there, it was very obvious that he had not been doing it. So I had these childhood memories of going there as a young child. And I remember the thatch building and the outhouse and the packed clay floor, the hard clay floor, and that there were a bunch of fruit trees and stuff which were growing there because it was a plantation. And here I saw that the house was there, but it had fallen down. It was like palm thatch on the ground. Likewise, the outhouse. So if I had wanted to gain ownership, I couldn't have just left off where he left off. I would have had to start from the beginning to build a house and an outhouse and such. And there were at least some of the fruit trees, coconut trees and such were still alive. And he said, well, the only reason that they're still alive is because these carob fruit thieves have been coming to take the fruit and basically clearing a space around the fruit trees to keep them alive. By Garifuna, he meant what they now call themselves. I mean, he said carob, he meant Garifuna. That's what they used to call themselves, as carobs. And I don't really think of them as fruit thieves. First of all, they were taking fruit that was just growing out in the wild that no one else was going to take. And secondly, they were actually kind of still farming the place, at least to the extent of cutting down the vegetation that would have killed the trees. And it's because of them that they are still alive. And so, Kite, Kite, the Englishman, when I went back in the 90s, I already heard that he was dead. He'd been shot by a Belizean policeman. And remember, the Belizean police do not carry guns. So he must have made this cop angry enough to go home and get his own personal hunting rifle. That's what most of the guns were down there for those who had any. Who had any guns. The majority of people didn't, although in the smaller villages, more of them did. But anyway, this cop must have gone home, gotten the gun, and shot him. I can kind of see how that might have happened, you know? Maybe he got drunk and hit a cop. Who knows? And oh yeah, the Mayans from up that way would come to town on the market day. There was like a farmer's market once a week, and they would come in with live iguanas with their mouths sewn shut so they couldn't bite any, which, you know, I'm sure that doesn't sound nice to you. And it didn't seem that nice to me, but people do got to eat. And yeah. Anyway, so Kite said, if you can get me a couple $100, I can get some Indians to cut this land back down. That way, you know, it will at least have been cleared and be back to how it was the last time it was cleared. And so I contacted my father in the US, and he agreed. He sent me money. I gave it to Kite, and I kind of lost track of what happened after that. So fast forward to the when I went back for a couple of weeks in the 1990s. So apparently what Kite had done is he had hired a team of local Mayans to clear that land. And then they asked, would they mind if he just stayed there? If the Mayans asked, could they just stay for a while, you know? And he said, okay. And basically they constructed a village. So when I got there again, I hired someone to take a boat down there again. In this case, a Garifuna dory. And there was a Mayan village. There were these, well, the fruit trees were still there, you know, the coconut trees and such. And there were these Mayan palm thatch huts. There was a turkey. No, there was a topless woman with a baby. Mayan women sometimes walked around topless, and also they would bathe naked in the river where people from the people driving by on the road above could see them. And this didn't mean, you know, that their women were easy or whatever. They just, you know, they always kept the bottom, well, except when they were bathing, they always kept at least the bottom half of their bodies covered. And usually, I guess, when the tops were off, it was probably because they had an infant and it just made more sense to give it quick access. And so I took pictures of a lot of stupid things like the turkey and the huts and the little bridge that they'd built. And then, unfortunately, when the whole Mayans there lined up, didn't have any more pictures left in my cheap paper camera, which is too bad. That would have been a good picture. And so some charity had built them a water tank. So that was all good. On the negative side, Mayans practice slash and burn agriculture. My theory is that that's why their city states fell, because you cut down the vegetation in the water. I mean, you chop down a forest basically and burn it, and you've got some empty space with some built-in fertilizer. But it's not all that sustainable because the wind and the rain will tend to push it away. And so you kind of have to keep moving around. You're going to move around in a circle. By the time you got back, the original plot would be fit to farm again, which they probably could not do beyond a certain amount of time and a certain concentrated population. So that's my theory about why the Mayan civilization fell. And so after I saw that, I went back to town. By this time, Amanda wasn't there. Most of them weren't there. There's only one of the women from that house that was still there, living in a little hut, thatch hut with 8 children. She'd only had one when I'd known her before. She wasn't raising it because I think they had temporarily she had lost custody of it. They didn't think she was fit to raise it. The highest authority there were the local police, but I guess they sometimes acted as the equivalent of child protective services too. So anyway, I was talking to her. This is back in the 90s, and but in the 70s, I'd stayed at her place too, and it was fine except for the fact that it had this vicious, snarling dog that I was always having to yell at, "No brownie, no brownie," to keep it from attacking me. So after a while, I was like, it's not worth it to stay here. I'm going back to your sister's place. I don't know why I was there in the first place. Maybe just for variety. Anyway, that same woman, I said, well, the Indians, the Mayans, they live there. She was, and, she was saying, well, what you got to do, you got to move back here. You got to buy a motor in the States where it's cheaper. The boat you can buy here, because I could have gotten, one of those dories or something relatively cheaply. And he said, and then you can go to Moho Bull and plant a little here, plant a little again, and slowly build it back up. And first of all, by this time I was 30, I was like, well, I had really romanticized Belize and dreamed of going back. And when I did go back, I realized, you can't go home again. Most of the women from that house were gone. The ocean, which I'd love to swim in, they now advised me not to because apparently it was black, meaning polluted, probably with fecal matter primarily. And I had become, I had briefly sort of become un-American. I had briefly, not entirely, obviously, but I had sort of gone native to a large extent. But I realized I wasn't that anymore. I couldn't just start speaking Creole to them as I had before because it didn't seem natural. By the time I left, I was slightly using Creole-ish phrases. I mean, I was it was sneaking back into my grammar. So, yeah, Kite had died. Maggie still lived there. Margarita lived in Belize City. Vanessa lived in Los Angeles. And Margarita, the girl I'd lost my virginity to, was dead. They all said a man had beaten her to death. She was probably about 29 or younger. I don't know how long ago it had happened. So that was sad. Later, by pure chance, I met her sister, her half sister, Margarita, in Belize City, where she was working in an ice cream shop. The ice cream making phenomena was new. They hadn't done that. They just had these little frozen, like Kool-Aid things, which they called ideals. You bite the corner and you suck them, and it was really good, even though it wasn't that good, and it tasted like, sugar and whatever. Not much, not real flavoring. But in that heat, for like 2.5 cents, it was like perfect. And then they also sometimes ate frozen condensed milk as a ice cream like treat. But in the 90s, they had their own ice cream they were making, and it was really good. And that is maybe the only way that it seemed like it had gotten better to me, because it was very touristy at that point, much more expensive, and yada yada, on and on. Anyway, yeah, I told her, Margarita's older sister, I said, I don't know, those Mayans have been living there and I haven't. It seems like maybe I should just let them have it. And she said, no, you can't. But I did. If they they didn't legally own it either, because they hadn't figured out the legal method of doing that. But they had all the stuff, the houses, the outhouse, the food crops. And if they ever just figured out the legal way to get ownership of it in the mildly socialistic government there, they could have claimed ownership of it. And they probably did. I hope they did. Before we left, I had the guy who was sailing the boat. He talked to them in Creole, which apparently they did understand. And I said, you can tell them that I'm the owner of this place, but I don't want to get rid of them. Make sure they know I don't want to kick them out. And so he told them, this man owned the place, but he no want to make you leave or anything like that. And I kind of realized that my family had kept a hold of Moho Bull, even though on some level we all had come to realize gradually that it was not practical for us to really live there, and that the laws were not conducive to absentee ownership or having a vacation home or that kind of thing. Later, unfortunately, when the right centrist party took over, they would become more so. But under the left centrist People's United Party, they weren't. And I actually think that is how it should be. So I didn't go back and I didn't fool around. I think my father might have kept paying the taxes till he died or couldn't maintain it anymore. He might as well, just because it's so low. And then I went home. Okay. Now we are back to 1977, 1978. So I came back from Moho Bull back to Punta Gorda, and I went there, and I always used to sleep naked, and they would scold me, or they would say, you know, why did you sleep naked, man? Supposing there was a fire, you might have to run out naked. Everyone will laugh at you. You know, if there was a fire, you wouldn't have time to get dressed. You'd have to run out of the house naked, and everyone would laugh at you. And I'm thinking, well, if there's a fire, first of all, that wouldn't be my biggest worry. And second of all, I would think that people would allow me a little leeway to be naked and outside because the house was burning down. So, there was a guy visiting us. This was the other American I talked about. Awful person. So his name, and I'm not going to bother to hide it. I don't know if he's still alive or not. Last I heard, he'd moved to Guatemala because it was cheaper and he could probably get away with doing what he was doing for, you know, a little bit of money, which he got a pension, which Margarita, Vanessa's sister, was actually forwarding him the check. Now, I've said in other videos that I think the word pedophile is greatly overused nowadays in our current atmosphere. There's a bit of a sex panic around it, and the term is overused. But this guy was the genuine article. He liked his girls, as far as I know, a range from 5 to 12 was the, and there was a 9-year-old and who knows how many others. And the weird thing is, people knew. And okay, you know, somebody might say, "Oh, he's nasty, but they didn't really do anything about it. For contrast, I met once with an elderly American man who also lived in Punta Gorda, but he didn't go out much. So I only met him the one time. He also had a vicious dog. And I think I talked to him about Florida, Anita Bryant, you know, her anti-gay crusade in an anti-gay teacher crusade in the late 1970s. And this guy was in Florida, and he said, well, when I was there, we used to take care of our own problems. For example, there was a guy who liked his girls young. I said, how young? He said, no hair, you know, no hair down there, young. And he said, and one day we hung the son of a bitch. And it's like, in the US, a lot of people would be like, yeah, that's appropriate, you know, or you can call the police and have them locked up, but then the other prisoners would hang him if they got the chance. So that's like a normal framework to me. But in Belize, they just didn't seem to care. And the woman who was forwarding, Vanessa's sister, who was forwarding his pension to him in Guatemala when I was went back in the 90s, she was the mother of the 12-year-old she had been with and the aunt of the 5-year-old that he had been with. And I mean, if I knew, I don't think I was learning any top secrets. I think people knew. Yeah, it's just I mean, it's actually kind of strange to me. There's sexual freedom, and then there are times when it goes too far, and I've talked about my views on that. And there's young, and then there's way too young. So, where was I going with all this? Mr. McNeary, and he also walked around with these sticks and did like fortune telling for people to earn a little extra cash. And, you know, the culture there was such that people were inclined to believe in such things. I don't think he ever did. It was just another racket for him. And we came over this night. So I and Vanessa were lying on the floor on a blanket and sheet on the floor, as we often did. I mean, there was the one bed, there was no one else in the house, but for some reason we were laying on the floor. Oh yeah, when I come back from Kite to Moho Bull, especially when we got onto the coast, there was a big rainstorm, and I was, you know, while he was rowing, piloting. Did he have a motor? Was he rowing? Maybe he was rowing. I was bailing out the water. I was pretty worried that the boat would just fill up and sink. So there was this can, and I was bailing really quickly. And to take my mind off my fear, I started talking about, you know, my trip to back from Livingston, Guatemala, where you know, they'd run out of gas and the sail had ripped and we had to drift. So I was taking my mind off the current boat danger by telling him about another time that I had been in a kind of potentially dangerous situation on the beach. Anyways, I got back. I was soaked to the bone. I took my clothes off. Vanessa was lying next to me. Mr. McNeary walked in and saw us. He didn't seem to care. He was talking about somebody he didn't like, and he said, well, if he gives me too much trouble, I could hire him, somebody from Guatemala, to kill him for about $25, which would be $12.50 US. I don't know if this was true, but just the fact that he was talking about it is more evidence that he was a bad person. But anyway, he left. And so now it was just me and Vanessa lying next to each other, me naked, her clothed. And we had kind of been sexual before. It never had quite, you know, it never had quite worked to do the whole thing. So then she started scolding me, and she said the same kind of thing. Why you did sleep naked? Posing there was a fire. You might have to run outside naked. Everyone will laugh at you. All that. And I was like, whatever. I sleep naked. I've slept naked since I was 5. Yeah. And we know each other pretty well by now. So I think it's okay. And then we were lying side by side. Her back was to me. And then I suddenly realized that her pants were also off. And without saying anything, either of us saying anything, about what we were going to do, what we were doing, or what we had just done. I just got behind her and culminated the friendship to the finish. And that is one of my right up there top, sex memories. And so later, I was talking to McNeary and some other foreigner, and McNeary said, "You know what I like about this place? It's the pussy. They get hot pretty young around here. By the time they're into their 20s, they've all had too many kids and bodies are pretty well shot. But before then, you can get them pretty young." And I said, I don't agree that they're, no good after they reach their 20s. And he said, well, you like older women. So apparently he had deduced what was going to happen that night before I realized it. Or he thought it was already transpiring, whatever. And those girls, were they really hot between the legs? Especially the little ones? I sincerely doubt it. So there was a time when I was laying in bed in the daytime, and Vanessa's young niece, who was early adolescent, slightly younger than me, came over and she started shaking me and saying, "Wifey, wake up! Wifey, wake up!" I was awake, but I decided to pretend like I wasn't because I wanted to see exactly what she was going to do. And she kept, she shook me and so forth. And then the sheet on top of me, I guess, had been removed, and she touched my chest and then my genitals. I was very intrigued because, like, this was the reverse of the Daphne situation, where I had done something similar to an older woman when I was, well, younger than her, quite young. And so I was kind of intrigued to be on the other side of that dynamic, but she didn't go that far. She said, "He can't wake up," and left. And then the next day, I didn't really follow. I didn't have to worry about whether she was into it or not. I knew she was. So, and we just culminated that friendship just once. She had been one of the ones that McNeary had been with when she was only 12. He was probably in his, I would think, 50s. I'm not sure, but yeah. And I said his name, which I shouldn't have, but I just was sort of, either I was teasing her a little, or it just kind of came out. I said, "Mac," and she cut me off and she said, "Who would want to be with that old man?" So she was denying it. I can't say I blame her. Yeah. Now, another time I was lying on the floor, Vanessa's daughter, Sasna, I was under a, well, we were both under a sheet. I was clothed. She was clothed. And she was wiggling around next to me, and I didn't, I guess there were other people somewhere in the house. I really didn't think much of it because wiggling around is, you know, what 4-year-olds do. It's totally normal behavior. And then she said, "Covered good, so they know us see what we did do." And it suddenly flashed on me that she thought that we were having sex, which we were definitely not. And I realized that I had to make it clear to her that we weren't, because if she thought we were, she was likely to tell other people. And I didn't want that reputation. Maybe they would have been okay with it, maybe not, but I definitely didn't want that story going around. And so I said, "After we know they do nothing," meaning, she said, "Cover good so they won't see what we're doing." And I said, "But we're not doing anything." And then I think I got up just to reinforce the point. She was just imitating what she'd seen the older girls and women do, which was wiggling around with some guy underneath a sheet, and she didn't really get the full picture, which is maybe okay. So then what happened? I stayed with the people in Barranco. Yeah, I mentioned that already. And I went back there. Yeah, they generally charge like $5 a day, meaning $2.50 a day to stay there, and you know, it included food and everything, so that was certainly reasonable. But the second time I went there, I had been to Belize City, and I had gotten like an ounce, a 1 bud ounce of marijuana, which was genuine. And I had also gotten some cocaine. The guy said, "I have a kit. You can see how pure it is." And I'm like, "I don't know. You don't have to do that." I do. I didn't really know how those kits worked anyhow. Anyway, there might have been a teeny bit of cocaine in there, but not very much. I had tried a little coke before I went down there. But someone else, there were these other people staying, and one of them was like, "Look, I know how cocaine smells the way I know how peanut butter smells. And this is not cocaine." I was just slightly agitated from whatever the heck, some sort of weak stimulant they put in it. Remember one of the Garifuna girls, I was walking back. I don't know. We had some sort of exchange. Maybe I was a little not totally friendly, or said something a bit rough or something. The other girl looked at her friend and said, "He looked good, gal." I mean, you can see why I liked it down there. I was like in a fool's paradise to a certain extent, at least for a while. Anyway, I had this ounce of good weed and I shared it, and I kind of thought that that would do instead of the $5 a day. But some other guy was there. he was staying there, I guess, American or Canadian, and he was like, he told me, you're not doing any work here, and we expect $5 a day, and you're not giving it to us. So I was like, okay, I guess this weed doesn't do instead of the money. I mean, they still got to pay for the food and everything. Yes, my mother and stepfather flew down to visit me in Belize City. And so I took the boat back up and I met some teenagers who were cool, and they smoked some weed with me, and then I bought some weed for them at the usual price, and I knew that my mother and stepfather liked it, and so I felt pretty cool, like I'm the one who scored for them this time. And they rented. They met an old friend of theirs who had a boat, and they took it. They chartered him for the day to get to back to Gales Point, where my mom and me had lived when I was a small child. And you really did need somebody to who knew the area, because there was this like maze of mangrove swamps, which, as I've mentioned, the pirates used to make use of. And I could see how you could easily get lost in there. But we didn't. We got there. I was able to notice, as now a 15-year-old, how dark and almost pure African, not Garifuna, but just straight up African they looked, which was probably because they were so isolated. And then on the way back, we smoked a little, and I curled up in a sheet, in a sail, which I used as a seat. There was an extra sail. I curled up in it and fell asleep. So that was, sadly, after they left, I found, well, I guess I'd found it before they arrived, a little place where they let me sleep, and there were a couple of young German women there traveling, and yeah, it was pretty nice. But it was, it was in an area that was kind of dark. I'd met some American guy, and he was just trashing Belize. He was like, everybody's got their hand out, from the little kid on the street to the prime minister. And I was like, what an asshole. What the hell are you here for in the first place? You ugly American. So, but then one night, and this was when my parents were gone, a couple of guys like backed me against a wall and were like, give me your money. And I started crying, and one of them said, oh, he's crying, let him go. So he let me go, and I walked back to the place, and I realized, I came to realize that they had been following me, and now in a more secluded and darker place, they put me up against the wall and took my money. I was not hurt, fortunately. But yeah, Belize City was definitely the roughest part of Belize, and I believe it still is, and quite a bit more so now. But I was like mad. I was like, I defended your country for you against an ugly American, and this is how you pay me back. Of course, they had no idea what I'd said to the guy, and there was no connection at all. And these were side trips. And then I decided to, well, I met up with this group of American traveling musicians. They would, they would sing in public and collect money. I don't think they could have collected much in these Central American towns, but then again, things were pretty cheap. So that's what they did. And they were buskers. And so I watched them perform. And then I caught a lift on them because they had rented a room. Not a room. They had rented a boat. And so I caught a ride with them first back to Barranco, where I stayed for a bit. And then back to Livingston. And I spent about a total of a month in Livingston and a month out of Livingston, wandering around other parts of Guatemala, pretty far, actually, hitchhiking and such. And, that part of Guatemala, the Civil War was active in. I had no idea how much so. I do remember seeing these soldiers with guns and cops with guns, and not just guns, so they carried pistols in the U.S. in those days, little clubs in Belize, in Belize, and like automatic rifles in Guatemala. And who paid for all that? There was a book I got a hold of called The People's Guide to Guatemala, which was basically a guidebook aimed at hippies of the somewhat left-leaning variety, which originally, most of them had been, but of course, all that changed quickly. Anyway, I learned that the situation in Guatemala and a whole lot of the rest of Latin America was the direct result of U.S. imperialism. And Guatemala especially had been bombed in the 50s, to keep their democratically elected non-military leader president, to get him out of power so that the banana company and whatever could keep control. And so they were it really got worse once I had left, but they were already starting to purge the Mayan villages. They might have been doing some mild labor organizing, and of course the government called this communism, and so people were already starting to get killed. And I was hearing rumors about that, but I really didn't get it. And since Guatemala is going to be a pretty big story in and of itself, I think this is a good time to end this stream. Thank you and good night.